Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for making the time to join us today. My name is Doreen Zhao, and I'm in charge of knowledge management and marketing for MSc Anglophone Africa. Let me take this opportunity to wish you a happy new year. It's our hope that at least 2021 will bring back some cheer into all our lives after a very unexpected turn of events in 2020 caused by the outbreak of the global coronavirus pandemic. For sure, this pandemic has paralyzed each and every one of us in ways that we never have imagined, not to mention the havoc it has wreaked on many economies, education and health systems, to mention but a few. It is for this reason we are here today to present our findings from our research on the assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on MSMEs, farmers, and CICO agents in Kenya. We conducted this research in 3 rounds between July and December 2020. We will also go further during the session and share some of the recommendations we have put forth for policymakers, financial institutions, and donor organizations to support the recovery of these sectors. At this juncture, I would like to make a very special appreciation to Swiss Capacity Building Facility, SCBF, who generously contributed by co-funding this research together with MSc. Thank you very much. Now, without further ado, allow me to walk you through our program for the next 1.5 hours. We shall kick off with a presentation on MSc's research on the assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on MSMEs, farmer, and CICO agents. This will be led by Diana Siddiqui from MSc. We will then move to a panel discussion where our panelists will share their insights on the impact of COVID-19, some of the coping strategies, and the way forward. Allow me to introduce our lineup of panelists for today. We start off with Fahim Ali. Fahim is the Chief Risk Officer, Musoni Microfinance. We have Farid Wangara, Insurance Portfolio Manager, ECA Africa. Michael Mbaka, Senior Innovation Specialist, FSD Kenya. Samuel Matonda, Director, Business Development Services, Marketing and Trade Department at the Micro and Small Enterprises Authority, MSEA. We have Victor Ogalo. He's the Head of Public-Private Dialogue and Policy Research Analysis at KEPSA. And finally, we'll be joined by Boniface Nyongesa, who's the Deputy Director, Enterprise Development, State Department for Industrialization. This panel discussion will be moderated by Sitara Merchant. She's the CEO of Swiss Capacity Building Facility. After the panel discussion, we will have a Q&A session. Kindly use the chat box facility to drop in your questions as we move along, and we will consolidate and address them as much as time will allow. We will then bring the session to an end with some closing remarks by MSc's Group Managing Director, Mr. Graham Wright. That is a quick highlight of how the session will flow. For now, allow me to call on Diana Siddiqui, a Senior Analyst in the Private Sector Development Department at MSc, to kick us off. Over to you, Diana. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doreen, and hello, everyone. For this webinar, we have compiled a presentation covering the findings from our research, the assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on MSMEs, farmers, and CICO agents in Kenya. We have conducted this research in 3 rounds, starting from July 2020 to December 2020. In the presentation, we will be sharing the highlights of the impact on these 3 segments, along with the coping strategies and the recommendations that we have come up based on the findings of the report. In the research, we have found that the businesses are recovering and slowly getting onto the operations. However, 39% of the enterprises still operate for fewer hours, as we noted in December. In addition to the recovery of the hours of operations, we see that there is also a gradual increase in demand with the increase in the number of customers that and Also, the volume of the sales per customer registering the reduction in the volume of sale. The decline has been reported from 53% to 23% in December. In addition to, when we look at the supplies of the MSMEs have been able to secure the stability in the supplies, whereas when it comes to the local supplies, most of the MSMEs have seen an improvement. However, the MSMEs that are depending on imports have to wait longer for the delivery of goods. We also see that almost 58% of the enterprises are still reporting a challenge in accessing supplies. Also, with the access to the supply is also linked with the cost of the supplies. And we see that almost 45% of the enterprises, they reported that the cost of the supplies have increased as compared to the level that they were used to before the COVID-19. Also, the cost of supply, when we look at the cost of supplies, it's the women entrepreneur segment which has been more affected as compared to the men entrepreneurs, both in terms of accessing the supplies as well as reporting the increase in the cost of the supplies. Entrepreneurs are also continuously facing the limited availability of credit from suppliers, where the credit supplier have almost 20% of the entrepreneurs reported that there is a reduction in supply of the credit from the suppliers. For business cost, there has been a varying effect from the beginning of the pandemic till the third round that we conducted. In the beginning, it was more of transportation cost, the cost to access the supplies, and the utility cost, which caused a bigger strain for the entrepreneurs. However, in December, almost 1/3 of the enterprises reported that the challenge to repay the existing loan is the biggest challenge for most of the entrepreneurs. At the household level, the enterprises are dealing with the increased expenses, and on the other hand, the household income has decreased. Almost 95% of the enterprises reported a decline of 36% in the average income. The decline in the income is not only because of the reduction in sales in their business enterprises, but also because of the loss of jobs and the pay cuts seen by the family members of the enterprises. And at the same time, the household expenses have increased. Almost 53% enterprises reported that they have experienced an increase in the household expenses as more and more family members and the relatives are dependent on the income sources from the enterprises. For the farmers segment, they have seen an improvement as the markets have opened, which has enabled farmers to sell their produce. As we see that after the relaxations of the restriction, almost 81% farmers reported that they are able to sell their produce more. However, the improvement in the sale has not resulted in the improvement of the farmers' income, as they are able to realize low price for the produce. In addition to low price for the produce, they are also facing challenges as far as the agriculture costs are concerned. Transportation costs have increased, and also farmers are facing challenges when it comes to paying wages or the repayment of loans and paying for supplies. The cost of inputs has increased, as well as the increase in the transportation cost is being passed on to the farmers in the form of reduced price. At the household level, farmers are also facing a substantial challenge when it comes to the decline in the household income and significant surge in the expenses. At the almost 93% of the farmers reported a decline, and in case of farmer segment, it is more than the MSMEs, almost 50% reduction in the household income, which is primarily not only due to the loss in the agriculture income, but also loss in the other non-agriculture income, which used to be a substantial source for supplementing the household resources. And more family members who have experienced the loss of job and the dependence of more and more dependents in the family are adding to the costs that the farmer households are experiencing, and as a result the expenses are going up. For cash in, cash out agency operations, we see that there is a recovery. Most of the agents, they suffered a decline of almost 50% at the beginning of the pandemic. However, the subsequent relaxations in the measures to prevent COVID, they have been able to resume operations for more than 10 hours, which has improved the footfall, and as a result, the number of transactions and the commission earned by the CICO agents have improved subsequently. In addition to the regular transactions, more of bank agents, they have been able to have an additional income source from the social cash transfer programs. And the social cash transfer programs also provided them with the opportunity for the agents who had other businesses running in parallel to the CICO operations, the opportunities for cross-selling. Though they also faced liquidity challenges when they were not well equipped, and they were also not well equipped on the safety aspects to handle the large number of beneficiaries at their outlets. Agents have also been facing liquidity challenges as the cost of operations have significantly increased. More and more agents, they had to use their personal transport vehicles to be able to access the bank branches and go for replenishing their float and e-values. Also, the non-dedicated agents, who were running other businesses, constantly had to make decisions on which businesses to prioritize and interchanging the liquidity, the available liquidity between the various streams of businesses that they were running. The liquidity remains still a top concern for many agents. Most of the agents have also received very limited support from the service providers. They have been implementing safety measures to protect themselves and their staff, but largely it was on their own cost. Also, they see that there is a reduced adherence to the safety measures, especially when it comes to the rural areas, and there is enhanced risk of exposure for CICO agents and their customers. MSMEs, farmers, and CICO agents have been using various coping strategies to deal with the current crisis. They have been reducing expenses to the extent that they resorted to most basic and the very essential items. Farming families, they also reported making dietary changes to be able to deal with the reduced income and the increased expenses scenario. They are also complying with the health and safety guidelines to protect themselves and the families. In terms of diversifying the income sources, more and more farmers, they started diversifying and looking at the non-perishable crops. MSMEs also diversified income sources apart from their main sources. Almost 1/3 of the MSMEs, they also reported that they are trying to leverage digital platforms to be able for their businesses. However, lack of technology devices and also lack of awareness is limiting the potential that the technologies can offer them to improve their business prospects. They're also using their own the financial reserves when it comes to savings or the sale of household assets. It is more pronounced among households in the rural and the peri-urban areas than the entrepreneurs in the urban areas. Borrowing has been a major concern. More entrepreneurs and hardly 22% of the farmers, they could access loans during the pandemic. Access to credit remains a challenge as the demand for the collateral, the stringent conditions, and the burden of the existing loans, which the farmers and the entrepreneurs are trying to manage within their meager resources. CICO agents are also trying to cope up with the current situation by managing the agency operations and also maintaining the liquidity and the e-float levels so as to satisfactorily serve their customers, as that remains a primary business for them, and they need to provide them the level of services that they at the best of their ability they can. Managing expenses also remains a key strategy when most of the CICO agents are trying to reduce the household expenses and also turning to their savings to meet the current expenses of their household as well as business. Complying with the safety and health guidelines remains a key coping strategy that most agents have adopted. Although the additional cost is a concern, but they have been managing it to be able to deal with the current crisis. Based on the understanding, we have come up with the recommendations for each of the segments separately. For the MSME segments, in a bid to boost the income, they need to be supported for market. They need to be supported for the market linkages for their products and services. The opportunities that can be provided through public procurement can help, especially the women-owned enterprises, can help them in a big way. Also, the payment of pending bills and the use of and the access through digital technologies and the platforms to sell online can help them boost the business and also adapt them to the changing requirements of the market and the changing economic scenario. For reducing the burden of the expenses, the tax relief measures to the most affected sectors need to be provided. Also, they need to be supplemented with forward-looking policies and programs that can revive the key economic sectors. Utility bill waivers and loan moratoriums can also prevent defaults and reduce the burden of expenses temporarily for the MSMEs. Access to finance remains a key challenge, and with the launch of the credit guarantee scheme, if it is implemented in a proper manner, focusing on the micro and small enterprises, can really help in a big way for the revival of the sector. Concessionary loans, along with financial literacy and business development support for MSMEs, is the need of the hour. Looking at the measures to benefit enterprises in the informal sector, it presents us with an opportunity to help this transition of informal enterprises to formalization. And the Micro and Small Enterprise Authority can play a key role. Allocation of budget to help this transition and the recovery of informal enterprises, which will help women enterprises also to a great deal, as women entrepreneurs own almost 60% of the enterprises are owned by women entrepreneurs in the informal sector. For farmers to be able to deal with the rising expenses and to deal with the limited income resources that they have, they need to be supported with measures to boost their income. Minimum support price can be a key strategies, as more and more farmers are struggling with low prices for their produce. Effective implementation of the agriculture economic zones and collaborations to help and to use this measure to benefit smallholder farmers and unorganized farm workers can help in revival of the sector. Social protection programs need to be expanded, as we know that almost 2 million population in Kenya has been pushed into poverty since the onset of the pandemic. In a bid to reduce the burden of expenses on farmers, more and more public-private partnerships are required to make transportation services affordable and accessible to farmers. Also looking at the coverage of the current input subsidy program, wherein almost 200,000 farmers will be covered, it needs to be expanded as the demand is far more than what is the current planning under the electronic voucher program is. Also, farmers need support in terms of the improved extension services and agriculture diversification for better price realization. Access to finance for farmers is also a key concern, and more farmers need to be supported and provided access to finance by way of establishing loan guarantee funds, leveraging solutions to reduce the transaction cost, and targeting specifically the farm sector will be helpful. Financial literacy also needs to be boosted needs to be promoted for farmers to be able to deal with the current crisis and also prepare them for future financial planning. Access to markets needs to be boosted where by use of the digital technologies, more and more farmers, this is an opportunity where farmers can be onboarded on various digital technology platforms, and farmers need to be trained to be able to make use of the digital technologies to access the financial and the non-financial services to be able to transform their current agriculture practices and the marketing support that they're looking for. For cash in, cash out agents, there are commission structures from the providers need to be reviewed for enabling them to earn revenues across all types of transactions that they are undertaking. For the social cash transfer programs, the MNO agents can also be included as they have better outreach in rural areas. In terms of reducing the burden of expenses, more monitoring mechanisms need to be ensured as the digital transactions are increasing. There is also a risk factor that is increasing simultaneously. So providers need to enhance the monitoring measures. They also need to have sustained campaigns to drive customers to the agent locations. We also need to look at enhancing the efficiency of the CICO agent model, wherein they are involved in social cash transfer programs. However, those cash transfer programs, they are dealing with the reconciliation issues that need to be addressed to be able to minimize the losses that sometimes the CICO agents have to undergo. Also enhancing the use of digital channels for monitoring and support, and learning management systems that can help CICO agents to recover from the current economic crisis. Agents also need to be supported for in terms of addressing the liquidity in the business, and hence they need to be supported with financial solutions to access short-term capital to invest in the float. There are also liquidity management agencies. However, many of the cash in, cash out agents, they are not aware of them, and hence making them aware about these agencies can help them gain access to e-value and e-cash. Also, the credit stimulus package that is being made available to the MSMEs, if it can be extended to cash in, cash out agents, would help them to address the liquidity issues. In this presentation, we have been able to cover the high-level highlights of the findings as well as the recommendation. We would request you that for all the 3 rounds, we have detailed reports in place, and you can access the reports for getting more details on each of the rounds of the research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana, for that very detailed presentation. I'm sure that everyone finds it insightful, and it has captured, obviously, the key insights from the research and some of the recommendations we have put forth for policymakers, financial institutions, and donor organizations so that they can support the recovery of these sectors. To reiterate what Diana has mentioned is that all these reports are available on our website. So kindly visit us on www.microsave.net, www.microsave.net in case you'd like to dive in deeper. So allow me to hand over the session now to Sitara Marchant. She's the CEO of Swiss Capacity Building Facility to take us through our next session. Welcome, Sitara.
Thank you, Doreen. And thank you, Diana, for a very insightful presentation. And as was mentioned by Doreen, the reports are available on the web. Let me start. As Doreen mentioned, we have three areas that we're going to focus on. The first is the impact of COVID-19. The second is the coping strategies. And the third is really around the resilience and the way forward. So let me start by asking Fahim from Musoni. Could you share with us the impact that the pandemic has had on MSMEs and in particular women enterprises? As we heard from the research, there is about 60% of the women enterprises in the informal economy. So Fahim?
Yeah, thank you, Sitara. I hope you can hear me. Yes, thank you, Sitara, MSME, and also, Swiss Capacity Building. Yes, in general, the most, but not all, the MSEs have been impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, directly or indirectly. The direct impact were due to mandatory or self-imposed closures of the businesses' activities, or by their own decisions also. Some of them have temporarily discontinued of doing their businesses for the personal reasons like health risk or family situation, so on and so forth. The indirect impact includes the consequences of the mandatory closures. Like if you all remember, there was a number of closures of going from the up countries or going from the urban to the up countries to the western areas to the eastern areas and even to the central. And this was also impacted with the value chain because these SMEs continue to in doing the value chain systems. Many businesses suspended their activities during this lockdown, full or partial. If you all remember, there was some partial and also some of the full, lockdown. We were unable to go in some of the, areas like in Mount Kenya or like in Western countries, up countries. It also affected the number of service providers, in particular to the street vendors like Mama Bogas, Boda Bodas, or small street restaurants also. Or hairdressings or beauty salons, etc. They were the most affected, especially these restaurants and Mama Bogas, the streets vendors. According to the CBK, 75% of them were at the risk of collapse. And this is also we have noticed from our site, as in Musoni. Most of the businesses do not have paid to their employees and they were unable to pay. And once we do the PPI, surveys, we also indicate that how much you are, creating the employment within your businesses. And it was adversely mentioned that, they are unable to pay to their employees. Most of them actually have laid down their employees. And once they have laid down, most of these employees or most of these workflows actually went to the up countries. And once they went to the up countries, the challenges increased more. Already there was so much, challenges in the rural areas, especially the rural smallholder farmers. Now, again, the domestic challenges also occurred over there. The health of the women was also adversely impacted, but through this relocation of resources and the priorities. Unpaid care workers has increased, and without the children's going to the schools, and then schools when it was closed, then again the value chain of these schools like suppliers, like MSME uniform service providers, the food service providers, the transport sectors, the buses and all that was also adversely affected. Economy also impacts, overall MSME and again the women entrepreneurs. More of them actually were looking to the economy situation, because once the economy is the way they always see that how the society is operating and how the resilient society they can work. Hence, the rapid assessment was also conducted by Musoni to understand, this impact. And again, we have also noted that most of our female or women customers, they have adversely affected, as is indicated also in this report. The impact was limited to the women ability, to support themselves, their families, especially for the female-headed households, or maybe the single mothers, who were adversely affected because of this, pandemic. We have also noted during our research that there is no equal distribution of food. Yes, there was some instances also where the distribution of food was there, but again, there was some that there was no equal distribution of the food. Children were eating first, and the others, at the later stage, or maybe especially the mothers and the females. This period saw the cases of gender-based violence also, especially on women entrepreneurs or the women households services. And again, the girls are due to economic and also the stress level and the restriction movement, because again, once you are restricted, you are all at one place. Then again, the gender, GBV always increase. The pandemic have already, impacted the health or well-being, and it is also a challenge of the financial and emotional stress, because it is connected with all the entrepreneurs and again your financial income, your cash flows, and all that. Even we have noted that our sick, or maybe the customers who are not feeling well, they were being cured at the home by the home-based, members or family, based members. Because they were failing to go to hospitals. Sometimes once there was a rumors in the airs that once you go to the hospitals, then maybe the government will take you to the quarantine facilities. So that was also somehow, stress to the income, to the overall, health matters, and again, the stress to the cash flows. And again, some of the entrepreneurs have actually closed their businesses because they were doing some businesses in some of the area was closure, or they were transferring or doing some value chains, which was also, affected, as also indicated in this report. In conclusion, what is that the client themselves are very sensitive in this uncertainty, and which has been impacted overall sectors of MSME and especially to the women entrepreneurs also. Sitara?
Thank you, Fahim. That was very insightful. I think what's interesting is just to hear the diversity of impact and how the impact has really affected women in particular. Of course, all SMEs have been clearly affected by this. I'm going to turn the discussion a little bit to Farid. Farid, could you tell us a little bit about the impact that the pandemic has had on farmers, and again, especially women? We'd be interested to hear your experiences.
Thank you, Sitara. You would remember first that sub-Saharan Africa was already facing food insecurity even before the global pandemic. For example, in 2018, FAO reported that almost 239 million people in the region were undernourished. Many of the countries have been experiencing chronic food crisis driven by a variety of factors, including economic shocks, climate, and conflict. COVID-19 added just another layer to these vulnerabilities. Of course, we saw a lot of border closure, lockdowns, and curfews that were intended to slow the spread of the disease. Definitely they disrupted the supply chains, restricting many people from accessing health, nutritious foods, while farmers are struggling to deliver their produce to the market and to acquire badly needed the agriculture inputs like seeds, fertilizer, and livestock feeds. The disruptions, of course, are devastating, bearing in mind that farming accounts to close to 67% of total African employment. We've seen, especially as CICO Africa, of course, we've worked with over 2 million farmers across our existence in the various countries, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and the various projects in other countries. Almost 52% of all the farmers we work with account for women. And we, of course, through the interaction that we've had, we've seen quite many challenges that they've encountered. For example, access to finance. We saw initially, for example, in 2019, we worked with very many microfinancial institutions. We worked with mobile financial institutions in large numbers over 2019, reaching to the smallholder farmers and providing finance. At the onset of the pandemic, most of these financial institutions were not able to go to the ground to be able to support the smallholder farmers, and who many of the farmers actually are women. So we saw, I would give an example, for example, we work with DigiFarm, which is a pioneer project for Safaricom. In 2019, where at the onset, we worked with close to almost 50,000 farmers. But for the long range, where the anticipation was to grow the numbers, we didn't do anything basically. Less than, I think 1,000 farmers were actually reached because, of course, of the restrictions and then the stigma that was there around COVID and everything like that. We saw slowed down lack of or completely lack of agriculture extension services to the smallholder farmers. This, of course, tries to enhance good agronomical practices and enhance quality food production. With absence of that, then you find very little is being done in terms of good cropping. We saw worsening financial well-being due to income losses. Quite a number of our farmers who depend on two or three different income streams could not be able to sustain all of them. Therefore, that again, of course, slowed down the economic activities. We saw a lot of the male farmers basically abandoning that, leaving it to the female farmers, therefore digging back into their own pockets to be able to support the agriculture sector. We saw a lot of unplanned withdrawals from natural savings, and of course, long-term investment that they've had due to the increased household expenses. This, of course, then meant that a lot of investment was not being done into the agriculture sector, but rather a lot was just being done in terms of survival. Yeah, generally that's the feeling we've had, especially on the impact on the agriculture sector. Africa being a pioneer in agriculture insurance, we found most of the farmers were not able to afford, because then they have to juggle between what I would term as luxurious activities and a provision of food and necessities to the table. Therefore, things like insurance, of course, many farmers would have had to avoid it for the sake of just basically supporting their normal needs. So a lot of challenges were quite experienced, and I think that has impacted negatively on the food structure for the country and generally in the sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Farid. That was very helpful. I find it interesting what you were saying, which is really that, you know, at the beginning of the crisis, there was already an economic food crisis, and the pandemic just basically exaggerated that and made it worse, and then also affected you as an Acre Africa being able to support these farmers. It just became very limiting. Just basically what we are seeing here is sort of a snowball effect of what's happening. What I'd like to do now is turn to Michael, who's with FSD Kenya, to really hear from you, Michael, as a key market facilitator. How did COVID impact the inclusive finance sector?
Thank you very much. So I'll talk generally in terms of the target segment that we've been discussing today. So overall, I would say the poor were more affected in terms of their coping mechanism. And I think a lot of speakers about access to capital. They have talked about depletion of assets and savings. And then I think the general financial well-being, if we could do a national check, that should have deteriorated. As 2019, when we had the last FinAccess survey, the well-being and was not good. So I expect now it should be even worse. But if I would look at demand side, yeah, so one of the impact is on remittance. We saw international remittances increased, but definitely the impact to the low income segment is minimal. But we do know that the domestic remittances slowed down, and this affected the low income segment significantly, because as we know, the financing of agriculture, the starting of small businesses is highly dependent on informal and remittances, and even in terms of survival, in terms of food and other family expenses, this was really affected because of the losses of jobs. and the closure of businesses or the struggling businesses. Then the other thing is the uptake of loans really slowed down, but we saw the increase in digital credit growing, but with a shift to more on high net worth individuals. Yeah, that excluded more and more of the low income people from the digital borrowing. We saw also an increase in the loan default, which would say, as much as we under rescheduling, which was very good, which was spearheaded by central bank, what we are not sure is whether this leads people to a debt trap because the businesses themselves are not okay, and or the enterprises, whether they are farming or other enterprises. And the other nature is most of these loans are short term. So the businesses may not get to recover before they start paying the 1 or 2 months rescheduling that was done. But on a positive note, we saw an increase in mobile money, due to COVID and the requirement to use digital by 50% since April. That was positive. Yeah, what as we've seen the cash in, cash out agents, the impact on these, whether this was going more into bills payment, direct bills payments, or because people are not cashing out, avoiding to hold physical money. Of course, that's the impact on them. That growth did not reflect. And because we know we are around 3.6 million new mobile accounts coming in, which was a plus on the supply side. Then, at least there has been noted, and the informal credit really reduced. And especially the shopkeeper and family and friends. And this is the main source of credit in Kenya for most of the low-income people. So this has really affected access to finance. On savings, I would say that we saw a growth of high net worth accounts. That's accounts above 100,000 in the country, but the same cannot be said for the low-income accounts. And in terms of insurance, would say we saw a reduction in insurance consumption. And actually, there was, I think 2 weeks ago, a report on earlier withdrawals of long-term insurance by households. And then 2 points on the supply side. I've already mentioned the mobile accounts really grew. But one of the things we've seen is reduced profitability. And we've seen an increase in the lending rates in actually this week by 1.5%. And what these may mean is that it might have an impact on the struggling demand side, because of the supply side also has reduced the appetites to lend. And the last thing that we've seen happening is that there have been a limit of the overall loan values by banks, as well as limiting the lending limits per customer. Yeah, a lot of the like the digital loans, even by banks, some have even scaled down the limits by 2/3. So maybe I could reach there in terms of some highlights. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. That was really useful. I found it interesting what you were saying is how the poor have been affected, of course, differently from those of sort of high net worth, as you call them, and the sort of the imbalance or the differences that are happening there. But I liked your positive note, which is really about the increase in savings for over 50%, even though that is, increase in mobile money since April for 50%. It's starting to show a little bit of a positive note. So thank you for sharing the findings there. I'd like to now go and ask Samuel. Samuel, what are the challenges do you see in the growth of the MSME sector post-COVID-19?
Thank you, Tara. There have been challenges in the MSC sector, and as my first presenters that have just made the presentation have said and confirmed is that when actually businesses collapsed. Most of the businesses in the micro and small enterprises sector collapsed. And this was because of the reduced markets, because of the curfews that were brought, that were put in place because of the pandemic. There were also high costs on imports that maybe raw materials for the because of what happened across the globe. And that led to layoffs and the loss of income from many households. The low income earners, most of them were affected, and because of the closure of businesses, and this really affected consumption. Another challenge that was observed is actually the reduction in farms' investments, whereby whatever investment that was to be done for the MSCs to be able to develop and even do business were put on hold or just stopped completely. There was a disruption of some sectors, a total disruption, which led to most of the sectors being declared redundant. More so, if you look at the tourism sector, which was largely affected, most of the MSCs in that sector actually closed down completely. And that brought another challenge of them wanting to go to another sectors, a new business where maybe they didn't have good enough skills and where they didn't have capital because now their business had been rendered closed. And that meant that they could not be able even to access funds, even to start new businesses, which could be either in agriculture. The agriculture sector, subsector, faced the challenge because of the closure of markets for the farm produce, and that really also affected the subsector and agriculture at large. Why were the micro and small enterprises most affected? As my other colleague panelists will confirm, it's because most of these micro and small enterprises are actually labor intensive and is a one-man or family business. So when one of the family members is affected, maybe quarantined or maybe is not able to access the other family members because of the restricted movement, or because of many other reasons that the pandemic brought about, then that meant that we could not be able to, the business could not run concurrently or normally as it was. And finally, just like Michael has just said, liquidity became an issue because of the reduced, the micro and small enterprises were lost, markets were lost because most of these were also being exported, and there is restricted and reduced inter-border trade, and that also affected the micro and small enterprises. Especially, I know that we have been coordinating what we call the Juakali Nguvu Kazi, or the ESC micro and small enterprises exhibitions, which rotates across the East African countries. But last year we didn't do it in December. So the micro and small enterprises that we have been promoting, they were not able to access. So it is affecting the Kenyan MSMEs, but it's also affecting the region and globally, because those are some of the challenges that we've been experiencing. Finally, on lack of skills. Now, most of these MSCs are now opting to go to another venture, maybe because of innovations, because they want to adapt. Unfortunately, there is no enough skills in maybe the sectors they want to venture into, and that also makes them not even be able to know how to move forward. And I think there is a gap there. So thank you very much for that. That's what I could say for the challenges that we've seen our MSCs facing in Kenya and the region.
Thank you, Samuel. I think it's if I were to summarize what we're taking away from what you talked about is really there's a whole need to rebuild and restructure some of the sectors, for example, tourism that you talked about and other sectors. And I found it also interesting how some of the businesses actually switched from what they were currently doing to something else, even so it shows some level of resilience, but also maybe didn't have the skills to make that switch. What I'd like to do now is turn to Victor. Victor, as an industry body, who works for an industry body rather, I'd be interested to hear how COVID has impacted the economy from your point of view. Impacted the economy. I think you have a very interesting lens and view on this. So we'd love to hear from you.
I think the whole world has been affected. So maybe let's not beat ourselves so hard. You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. Okay, it's okay. Yeah, the whole world has actually been affected by COVID. Okay. Except I can't see myself, but that's there's no problem. I think let me just proceed. If you look at the whole world economy in terms of the impact of COVID, no one actually imagined this when we woke up to the new year 2020. So, and as it was beginning to look like there was a pandemic, a majority of countries, including developed countries, thought that this was actually going to be a Chinese or at most the East Asian affair. Little did they know that it would actually traverse the whole world. So when that happened, there was really no country that was prepared, apart from actually China. China was prepared because they already had a similar pandemic in at the beginning of this was 2002, 2003. The South Korea was prepared. These are countries like in Vietnam were actually prepared. These were countries that had the first wave of SARS in the year 2002. So immediately they had about a similar pandemic because both of them were actually SARS, except this is now called COVID, but it's actually a SARS virus. Those East Asian countries were better prepared. And that explains why their curve has actually been flattening, and it started flattening way, way earlier. When the rest of the world was going into limbo, closing down, you all remember that actually China was rising up and now producing for the rest of the world that was shutting down. So that is why it's really not a surprise. If you look at what we expect to see in the whole global economy, we expect to see a negative growth and a very big negative growth globally. If you look at the global economy, over 203,000 negative drop from what we had in 2019, 2000, which is 2.9%. to negative 3% is what we expect the whole global economy growth to be. US will grow by negative, the growth rate will be affected by negative 112. It will shrink by negative 112 or by 112. If you look at Italy, France, Germany, all these countries are actually going to grow into the negative. For a country like Kenya, and indeed a few other African countries, we anticipated the growth to be 6.1 in 2020. So what we would expect is that by June this year, when we are closing the financial year, we would be hearing a growth of 6.1%. But when COVID came in March and we had the lockdown measures, the heat, and production was going down and everything basically coming to a standstill. We revised that, rather the National Treasury actually revised that growth to 2.5 initially. But as we started relaxing some of these measures, we've seen some pockets where we could expect growth. And so the expected growth of the forecast has actually been revised just slightly up to 2.9%. So that's what we should expect. So from an initial expected growth of 6.1, we can only expect maximum 2.9% growth. But then again, that also will depend on what we do between now and June, in terms of whether we're going to have another, a set of restrictions, or we're going to relax more and more, depending on our behavior and with the COVID protocols. So it's really not a surprise. In terms of how this then has impacted on SMEs in totality, 86% of SMEs. We've done a series of researches. We have 4 researches that we did just to look at the impact of SCBF. 86% of MSMEs, the micro, small, and medium enterprises, had experienced loss of income and cash flow constraints. And I'm talking about, this was by June, July. And the same is actually replicated in a document by National Treasury called, it's a draft economic recovery strategy that is supposed to be implemented to deal with the impact of COVID. So they are saying MSMEs, 86% of all these businesses we are talking about lost their income and cash and serious cash flow constraints. And as we had more lockdowns, then the cost of business operations also became a bit high. And so you're actually talking about increased cost of operations. So competitiveness of nearly all businesses across different sectors is something that's going to be of great concern even as we move forward. But allow me just to point out specifically on what we see in terms of the financial losses that we are talking about. How does this play out between the different business sizes? What we actually see is that financially 59, about 60%, that is close to 2/3 of micro enterprises in this country, reported to us that they had losses ranging above 50% of their 2019 financial status or revenue status. And that was as of September last year. That, if you compare with what the small enterprises reported, 23% reported having lost 50% of their, being in a worse situation than they were in 2019 with 50% reduction in revenue. The medium-sized enterprises were 37% reported the same, and only 13% for large firms that reported that they actually lost 50% of their 50% in proportion to their 2019 revenue. And that, of course, is obvious that the large enterprises, of course, perhaps have better buffers and maybe perhaps are better prepared to deal with such things, and maybe can also access resources in different ways to cushion them than the smaller enterprises. So maybe in terms of that particular question, I would want to end it there, but just to mention on 3 main sectors where we saw serious repercussion of this particular impact is tourism. For obvious reason, that was a totally lockdown sector. We also had the education sector, and manufacturing also took a serious beating. But now, what we saw between the situation we had in April, May, June, versus now what we had in September, October, and November, the situation seemed to be actually improving dramatically. If you compare what we had in how business were affected, different sectors were affected in early when the lockdown measures were in place, versus now when we started to relax them in July, August. So I think there's some ray of hope, but that is going to depend very much on whether we maintain these protocols, how we behave at individual level and as a society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. That was useful. It's good to hear that there is a good news story. And no, everybody, absolutely, you're right. You started off saying that, you know, let's not beat ourselves up. You're absolutely right. I think there's some amazing things that have happened during this time, both in terms of growth, and there's also some things that, you know, haven't worked so well. So I think hearing from you that there seems to be an uptick a little bit in the economy is actually a good news story. Thank you. I'd like to turn to Boniface. Boniface, could you share with us how the COVID-19 has impacted the focus on industrialization in the country?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you? Okay. Hello.
We see you. We see you and we can hear you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. As other speakers have spoken, the COVID-19 has affected the country, the economy of the country, seriously, because the economy just dropped and shrunk, and affected the livelihoods of the households were affected seriously. When it came to manufacturing, it was even more hit by the COVID-19. And the reason why the industrialization of the SME sector has been so much affected by COVID-19 is because of the vulnerability nature that exists amongst our MSMEs. Most of the MSMEs, they are very vulnerable to any shocks that come across. I think what we should do as a way forward, we should try to strengthen the SME sector so that they don't suffer so much from these shocks that come every now and then. Because most of our SMEs are very vulnerable, and the small changes in the economy and the small changes in the world economy or the country economy, they are seriously affected. So COVID-19 actually affected our SMEs so seriously, and industrialization in general. I think we can talk about the issue of job losses, for example, in enterprises. Many job losses because of lack of production. And the other thing which was affected seriously was the issue of the value chains. As you have heard from other speakers, the value chains were really disrupted because of the lockdowns and restriction of movement. So the value chains were really affected across the country. And this also affected so much in the manufacturing and SMEs and industrialization in general. This led to the issue of value chains, led to issue of the high input costs. Input costs for both farming businesses and other manufacturing businesses were probably about very high costs of inputs. And therefore, because of the disruption of the value chains, supply chains. They also depressed the issue of depressed markets. The demand for most of the manufactured goods was very low because of the COVID-19. So there was a depressed market for both farm produce and industrial products because of the containment measures which were put there. And also there was low purchasing power because most of the people who could purchase these products were not earning much, so they could not. The money which was available was only to buy the essential products, but the rest people could not buy them. So the issue of low purchasing power was there, which brought about depressed market. Brought about a depressed market, and I think most of the things that I wish to talk about has already been said by the other colleagues. Maybe I will stop there, and or if you wish, I will talk about interventions that the government has put in place. But for now, let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Boniface. You're right, we've covered quite a bit in the first part of the session, so I'm actually going to jump to, and most of the panelists have already spoken about coping mechanisms. So we're going to jump forward to building resilience and the way forward. So, and so what we'll do, Boniface, is come back to you for that section so that you can come in then. So what I'll have is perhaps ask Fahim to start off with, what steps are you taking to enable more access to finance to SMEs?
Okay, I think.
Sorry, Boniface, let's come back to you.
Yes.
I was posing this question to Fahim. I can come back to you with a couple of other questions if you don't mind.
Yep.
Great, thank you. Fahim?
So do I continue? Do I continue?
Thank you, Boniface. Thank you, Sitara. Yeah, you can hear me, right?
I can hear you. Boniface, we'll come back to you. We'd like to hear more from you, but we'll come back to you if that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead, Fahim.
Okay, thank you, Star. Against this crisis, the financial access is the vital supporting households and businesses. And Musoni, we have already a very good building of technology. That's why we always call it high tech and high touch. Our main focus on this business continuity during this period was one, channels, the channels which we use. One of the most important insights from the COVID-19 pandemic is to need to find the ways to reach and interact with the customers, not just because we have to observe the social distancing, but also because of the normal times where the people value convenience and services. It's not like you are more in interacting them physically, or we have to connect them virtually and to bring them in the digital world. Many providers have unnecessarily started building alternative channels, and again, more changes. But again, in Musoni, we already have so many alternative channels, and we were using, our existing agent module, which we call it Friends of Musoni. We have also indicated, and we were using more of our remote customers onboarding, because in this time you can only manage your existing customers. How about the new customers? How about the people who need financial access from you? So we were onboarding them, remotely through our different digital channels, and we were also enhancing the customers care centers, more services over there, because again the digital literacy is more important. Also, we have noticed during this pandemic, we have invested lots of money on financial literacy and on digital literacy, and we have conducted a number of digital literacy events and programs also during this period. We were in constant touch with our customers. With this shows that we have done almost around half of our customers virtual trainings, and we have done virtual trainings through video conferencing, audio conferencing, or even call based, or even SMS based, or even WhatsApp services. We have conducted this virtual trainings and other trainings. We have first, started with the COVID, measures. Then again on the business and financial management, how they can manage with and cope with this, pandemic. Then again, managing the cash flow analysis, because this is how they have to manage their cash flows. We have also, on the non-financial services, we have also done somehow the mental stress trainings, including with our partners, Jubilee Insurance, and again, our partners, Arahan Services. So this non-service financial services was quite important for all of us, because that was the key agenda for all of us. And from these all services, we were also using simultaneously our data to understand our customers, our research, our impact surveys, to understand our customers, to identify their needs. That's why we have also changed number of product diversification. We have also changed number of services. Remember, we cannot work where we were working traditionally or before the pandemic. We definitely have to change few things. We cannot say that, okay, our previous credit scoring module was saying that customers should be deploying or applying on this one, and then only he have to be able to do this one. This pandemic have disturbed everything, and fintech, CRV, or negative listing was there. MSMEs was conducting number of surveys on that one also. So this was to support the low income businesses and households, to support them in cope with this services. And also overall, we also try to do that, how we can build this one, And also we have, as also there was one of the part in the presentation earlier, that how the microfinance institutions also try to build, a cash flow modeling, not only on the security modeling. And that's why the guarantee partners need to come. And that's why our partners like AGF, like USAID, they have really helped us in these guaranteed partners. And we have also, reached to the number of rural areas where there is a problem on security or collateral issues. And then again, we have access to finance, allowed them to, cope with these services. This actually helped our customers to manage their existing cash flows at their businesses or their households, and also start their businesses as wherever they want to do. our main key agenda was to build back better. This was our key drive, for this pandemic, and this is still we are working so that in this challenging economic times, we support our customers and build, more resilience strategies. Sitara, thank you.
Thank you, Fahim. I like the phrase "build back better," and it's really encouraging to hear that financial inclusion institutions like yours are actually onboarding new clients, shifting to digital. And not only that, the key component, I think, is really bringing the client into, so providing that digital literacy and really bringing them up so that they can be using digital financial services. We're seeing that as a key need at this point in time. So thank you for that. Fareed, I'd like to ask you, how can the government, from your point of view, how can the government and donors support the private sector in building the economy? Fareed, I think you're on mute, so maybe you want to unmute.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much. I think there's quite a lot that can be done by both the private sector, the donor community, and of course through public-private partnerships. From a government perspective, of course, there is need for building better business enabling environments. For example, reforming business registrations, contracting laws, and providing the infrastructure essential for business, such as, of course, electricity or transport connections. Addressing constraints to growth in specific markets, for example, problems related to how supply chains function, including infrastructure, access to finance, human resource, and the connection between the parts of the supply chain. Looking at maximizing the development impact of individual businesses, for example, supporting businesses to implement business models that serve the poor as consumer producers and, of course, employment. With regards to pandemic, of course, we are looking at the government reviewing processes in the regulations. For example, things like obtaining permits, reduction in taxes, reduction in taxes. We also look at access to finance. Of course, liquidity remains a challenge as financial situations worsen and coping strategies exhausted. Emerging financial loans could support future recovery efforts, I think, from our perspective. Access to affordable inputs and raw materials. We've seen various programs like the e-voucher being supported by the government. I think widening and expanding the outreach of such programs to the more marginalized people could actually help in fast tracking and uplifting people from this pandemic. We also look at probably expanding market access, would be able to help farmers, smallholder farmers, SMEs to connect to new buyers, new market information and transport. Of course, designing more digital market tools. We'd look also to lowering barriers to entry to digital methods. Currently, I think around 26% of farmers have increased use of digital platforms. And some of the barriers we're looking at include, of course, lack of affordable internet access, access to better smartphones, which of course still remain a bigger hindrance. Most farmers still are on, or rather use feature phones. We could also probably, in Kenya, we saw the government allowing SMEs, people who had taken facilities to have moratorium for loan repayments or rescheduling based on individual capacity. I think if that is pushed again to continue past the recovery period past the COVID period could help in the recovery efforts. We've seen even the government itself seeking restructuring of governments from its lenders. Government could also provide interest subventions on loans as help in recovery efforts. Commodities purchased by governments, for example, are, as at yesterday, I think I saw national cereals and produce board increasing the price for purchase of this. That is one good way of ensuring that farmers' produce are collected amid, of course, the high cost of production that was experienced over last year can be able to be recouped by farmers through increase of prices, and of course the government trying to purchase the produce from farmers at a much more reasonable prices. We've seen interventions by international donors like AGRA, for example. We work with AGRA with training of village-based advisors, whereby we, of course, disseminating information back to, from a localized perspective. So we work with village champions in terms of training.
Been driven very high because of integration of mobile and banking. The mobile banking would say those numbers are very high, some as high as over 70, others 80%. But if you look at utilization, is quite low. If you look at things like costs, the cost of accessing finance is quite high. Yeah, both from transaction point, and I think that's how even like we saw that the central bank coming in to intervene on low ticket mobile transactions to be zero rated. And then if you look at the value that people derive from financial services, I think would classify that to be low. And to illustrate this, for instance, if we are saying over 60%, ending 70 of the Kenyans have access to savings, which is good. And if we look of the number that is close to maybe 40-something% who are accessing credit, would say less than 5% are accessing from the conventional sources like the bank loans. Now it's growing up because of the digital lenders, because of course there are some barriers that have been broken by that. But still would say a lot of people have been left to access the type of products that are not appropriate. For instance, if someone is doing businesses and they're accessing monthly digital loans and their cycles, they cannot be able to produce the same amount of loans in terms of their turnovers. And of course, from their turnovers, we're talking of profits to be able to repay these. Then there's a challenge. So a lot of people are on a debt cycle. Yeah, and we saw also the financial well-being dropping in 2019 significantly. And so I'm saying this to set a stage to say that, yes, we need to refocus financial inclusion to more of talk what's the value. But having said that, COVID maybe has also increased the need by looking at some areas, for instance, the social safety nets is an area that Kenya has done well, relatively well, but a lot can be done. But there is a need now to reimagine these, including even small businesses. How do we include them in safety nets? And how do we need to structure these, including the unemployed, which the country is toiling without to include even graduates who've been out for some time without jobs. And also in terms of, I think if you look at, I saw an analysis that has been done for over 40 years, showing that in early 80s, we earned Kenya mainly was formal, was driven by formal, including employment. But now it's the gap, it's almost 70% gap in terms of percentages between formal and informal. We are largely informal. So we need to be asking ourselves, what's the role of finance in growing in the informal markets, which I think it's something, the instruments that we have are not appropriate. We rely largely on them, on things like friends, relatives, and merry-go-rounds and the like. And then the other area, I think, because of COVID, we may want to reimagine is what's the role of public in especially I think without shying say in underwriting market risk or giving incentives. Yeah, I know we've seen things like credit guarantee for SMEs launched, I think for I think was it around 3 billion or so. We've seen quite a number of initiatives taken, but I think we need to push more and see, of course, with the limited national budget, how can we be able to increase public participation in either underwriting some of the risk or in encouraging the players to do more. And lastly, I think the financial inclusion as it is, I think we have fundamental areas to tackle, possibly not even because of COVID. For instance, if we talk of credit, yeah, everybody will always say credit is short term. That's, I think, the biggest impediment. And the question is, with the structure of savings on call, largely being what support this, what can we do as a country? Because again, if you're talking of recovery now, if the businesses takes the loans, and I think I would quote one of the CEOs in my parting shot of one of the leading banks who mentioned in one of the forums we had that actually the rescheduling of the loans has created a debt trap because the businesses are not okay and they are accessing the same type of credit products that would possibly be a future catastrophe that we are waiting. Yeah, both in terms of the businesses themselves, but also in terms of the suppliers and the banks, because they are not engaging with healthy businesses and they are not even increasing simple things like the tenor. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. That was helpful. I think what we're seeing, and I think the theme that continues in the financial inclusion sector is really about client-centric products, developing and delivering client-centric products. I think as a result of COVID, really looking at social safety nets and how to bring those to fruition so that we can get back on track. And I think the other one is really about bundling financial products and services so that people can access insurance for resilience purposes. We're really running tight on time here. And so I'm going to ask the rest of the panelists, which I will be asking questions to please just share one or two highlight points on the questions that I do ask you. So I'll go back to Samuel. Samuel, what is MSEA doing about the crisis? And is there anything you want to share, particularly in light of the fact that there are almost 7.4 million enterprises in Kenya, and around 80% of them are in the informal sector? Samuel, there you are.
We were part and parcel of including the credit guarantee scheme, collateral loan. What it is also worth noting that we have taken advantage of this to be able to even formalize and get to register the micro and small enterprises. We have the MSC, the MSC registrar in place, and with the help of the UNDP, we have put up a platform that is going to really fast track the registration of the micro and small enterprises which are in the informal sector, because they have also appreciated that by not being recognized and not known where they're operating from, and not known the challenges they are facing, it was very difficult for us to even share opportunities for them, especially when it came to marketing opportunities. So we have taken advantage of that. We have devices whereby all the MSCs come together under one roof, and we are giving them the support that they require. Already we have one in Nairobi at Kariobangi, and we are spreading out in all the other counties. Yes, we are taking advantage of this to even capacity build the youth through the project. That's a Kenya Youth Employment Project, which is a World Bank donor fund, but it's a government of Kenya project. And there are many other initiatives that we are doing, which are targeting the micro and small enterprises. So I'll be brief because of time, but then we concur with all the other panelists that yes, the micro and small enterprises sector is the one which was most hard, and yet they control more than 80% of the entrepreneurs in the country. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Samuel. It's great.
I think I was that brief.
Thank you very much. It's great to hear that there's work happening. I think one wouldn't necessarily think that, you know, having all the SMEs registered and would be so important to being able to respond in such crises. But I think COVID has really opened our eyes in terms of understanding the importance of registering. And it's great to hear that among other initiatives that you're taking on, that you're also focusing on the youth, because I think that's a very important sector. I'd like to ask Boniface, if you could please, in a few sentences, and I'm sorry because we're out of time, but I will finish off the questions. How soon do you anticipate the enterprise sector to be coming back on track? That's to Boniface.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I think what you have asked is a hard question to answer, but I'll give 3 points. The first point, what is important as a government, we have to do policies. We have to put in place policies that can improve on the coping capacities of our SMEs. As I said earlier, most of our SMEs are very vulnerable to shocks. So we should put in place policies and strategies that can improve on the coping capacity, which will improve on the resiliency and the recovery of the SME sector or the industrial sector. The other point that I want to put forward so that we can recover quickly is the issue of local content policy. Local content policy talks about we buy Kenya, build Kenya, buy Kenya. We should encourage our SMEs to be able to produce products which are attractive to Kenyans, so that we buy from our own. So that's one of the things that will make us recover very fast from this pandemic. And the other one is to expand market. If we do well on coping capacities and coping strategies, we should be able to make good products which can command a good market. So we wish to expand our market so that we'll be able to recover quickly. So I think those are the 3 points that I want to mention about recovery of our industrial sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Boniface. That was really succinct. Nice 3 bullet points. I won't add anything to that. I'll go to Victor. Victor, as an industry body, are you advocating any changes that will impact the MSME sector, farmers, or the cash in, cash out agents?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Star. We are doing so much, and I'm actually happy with what we've done so far. Remember that we were the first institution to lay down the measures that were, most of which were actually announced by the president on 25th March last year, when the first economic stimulus interventions were actually announced by the president. We had come up with what you call a COVID-19 management framework and recovery. And it had a raft of interventions. Some of them looked lofty, some of them were actually very, very bold. But they are the things that we really needed to have in place to really get us out of the mud. And when we realized as a country that we needed to stand together, the president understood the urgency, but also the sacrifice that the government really had to make, because we were not doing very well financially as a country, but we still needed a lot of concessions in terms of a package, financial, or rather fiscal and monetary package. That would mean the government would have to forego sufficient revenue in order to keep businesses afloat. So that is coming up again, because we've enjoyed a few of those benefits as we've seen from our members how many of them are saying they benefited from those measures. But I think we should all remember that most of them are coming to an end starting this month. The reintroduction or taking back the VAT to 16, the pay back to where it was. So a number of these measures that enable businesses to stay afloat are actually coming to an end. And this is now where I would say we come in again and say, it's way too early to lift these measures. Because remember, from our latest research, 43% of businesses only expect to recover by end of this year. So if they're on a recovery path, and what has been sustaining them to make such projections that they can wave through the tides and maybe expect to recover by end of this year, if you pull all that down, then basically you're worsening a lot more of these businesses. So our advocacy revolves around asking the government to reintroduce some of the economic stimulus measures that had helped businesses to stay afloat, because practically actually businesses benefited. So stuff like reintroduction of the, reduction of the VAT, the pay, all these are measures that we're actually asking the government to reconsider, not to lift them way too early before we can be strongly on what I would call a strong foundation to move on. Then the second thing, I think I do not want to really reiterate what you had actually presented in the opening presentation. The credit guarantee scheme really has to be real. So that is another thing. We expect to have discussions with government on expediting the rollout of the credit guarantee scheme. Issues around AGPO, making it really work and not becoming a vehicle for just a few businesses, but really expanding the scope of access to AGPO is another very important measure that we think we need to put on the table. How we're going to do that is a different question altogether. But if we want all this to work, we really also must appreciate that the government needs resources to help us sustain these measures. So to carry, we'll be expecting that we can have more discussions around expanding the tax bracket, the base of the contributors, because it's from there that we can have a meaningful discussion by saying, well, revenue collection is expanding because you're also expanding the base. So we can actually expect to have a conversation around reducing rates. We can expect to have conversations around sustaining some of the waivers, whether they are VAT waivers, whether they are import duty waivers on essential products, whether they are waivers on stuff that is supporting farmers. We can only have that conversation if CARE is also successful in collecting. So let's also play our part in terms of really paying our fair share of taxes instead of involving ourselves a lot in tax evasion. And here we bring in larger enterprises that are very good at tax evasion. But also just to ensure that each of us gets a sense of responsibility to pay tax, because that's the only way we can succeed. Allow me to mention the issue of tax refunds, VAT refunds, and pending bills. We've been on the forefront, because when you're talking about dealing with issues around credit constraints or cash flow constraints, it's real and genuine. And this we can only achieve if we also push hard, as we've done in the last 8 months, when we had a honest conversation with the government on clearing most of the pending VAT refunds and pending bills by county governments and different government agencies. So that's another war front. So besides the credit guarantee scheme, let's also look at VAT refunds, let's look at cross-border trade, the non-tariff barriers that are instigated by COVID. We can actually have a conversation. Most of our SMEs actually export or import. So sometimes you are importing raw materials, but COVID instigated NTBs are raising the cost of your inputs. So let's also put that on the table. And then, of course, we are looking at measures around capacity building. The business BSD services really need to be ramped up. Because as we saw with most of women-owned and youth-owned enterprises that we talked to, business development service is a wanting area where we need to pull up our socks. And most people are in business because the last resort, not because it's what they favor. But as long as you are there and you really want to grow, many small enterprises do not make it to grow because they lack effective BSD services. So let's also think of programs around BSD. And basically, when you talk to KEPROBA, can we have these SMEs engage with KEPROBA on certain development initiatives to help them export, to help them open markets, with KIRDI to help them with product development, right? And business incubation. So these are the things that we are looking at as KEPSA, even as we move forward. So others have been mentioned. I had a raft of recommendations, but others have been mentioned by the previous speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor. That was helpful. It's interesting to hear. I mean, it's sort of, if I were to put them into three buckets, one is really about not lifting the support that is already in place and actually continuing it over long term. And then the second one is really about restructuring and bringing, enabling again, people to re-engage with business or bringing them out of the debt that they have incurred, and then providing support mechanisms so that they can actually move forward, whether it's through guarantees or other aspects. Well, that brings us to the end of the panelist discussion, and I want to thank all the panelists for your input and your insights. I think for me, at least, it's been a very useful session to sort of dig deeper into the research that was done and to hear more in a three-dimensional way how things are working and moving forward. On that note, I'm going to pass it over to Doreen, or ask Doreen if I know we're over time, it's 1:15 the hour. Doreen, do we have maybe one or two pressing questions that we can address, or how would you like to move forward on this?
Yes, thank you, Sitara. Thank you, all the panelists, for that insightful discussion. I think let's just take maybe just one question. If there's any more time, we can do two questions. One question has come from Samuel Dako, and he's addressing it to Samuel Matonda. So the question goes, it will be great. Actually, it's more of a comment like a question. It would be great to give us the macroeconomic indicators, that would be inflation, forex rate, etc. in Kenya, as a background to how COVID impacted on household expenses, cost of supplies, and importation. Samuel, would you quickly take this? Samuel? Looks like Samuel has dropped off. We quickly move to the next question. This goes to Boniface Nyongesa, and Eugene Arua is asking, why hasn't the government considered or creating or promoting insurance safety nets that are relevant to SMEs and farmers? Boniface, you can take this one.
Can you come again?
So Eugene is asking, yes, Eugene is asking, why hasn't the government considered creating or promoting insurance safety nets that are relevant to the SMEs and farmers? Over to you, Boniface.
I think what the role of the government is not to actually create the safety nets. The role of the government is provide enabling environment for private sector to engage in insurance. So as a government, we cannot do insurance. We only put policies across so that the private sector can now come in to ensure the safeness of SMEs, which I think the government has done so far. So far, I think the insurance environment in the country is good. And I think it's upon the private sector now to come in and take insurance. But I know that SMEs also have a problem. Most of them don't want to come out. They want to work undercover. And when you work undercover, you find that insurance will not come for you. As Mr. Madonda said previously, the registration of SMEs is very important for them to be insured. So the government has put ACL in place. The policies are necessary for them to be insured, but the SMEs must also come out, must also need to understand the importance of insurance. You know, maybe from our side, what you can do, you can engage capacity building of our SMEs so that they can know the importance of insurance. But for now, most of the SMEs we have, they hardly think insurance is important. Even if look at our farmers, a farmer buys a cow which is 200,000 shillings, and you ask him to insure the cow, he says, "Oh no, I believe the cow will not die," and finally the cow dies and he loses the 200,000 shillings. So what we need to do, let us do capacity building on SMEs so that they can know the importance of insurance. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I know we have a few questions and a few comments that have come through. Thank you so much for making the conversation very engaging in the chat. For those questions that we've not answered, we will definitely get in touch with you by way of email. Allow me now to introduce MSC's Group Managing Director, Mr. Graham Wright, give us some closing remarks. Welcome, Graham.
Hi, everyone, and thank you indeed for joining us on this webinar. I really appreciate it. It's been fascinating, and I think everyone's probably had enough by now. But along with many, many other countries, Kenya is in crisis, and we have to be very straightforward about that. Next week, we're running another webinar covering studies, similar studies from India, Indonesia, Philippines, Uganda, and Senegal as well. And you see the same recurrent themes with businesses that have run down their resources, unable to access credit, very often not getting access to government support because they are not registered, and so on. And I think that the speakers have made really good points, and points that indeed we've made in the reports, that this is a unique opportunity for governments to encourage micro and small businesses to register and allow them, therefore, to formalize and get access to a wide variety of services from which at present they are excluded. But to respond to this crisis will take additional resources. And I think in particular, somehow we need to get liquidity back into the system. Too many farmers, too many MSMEs simply don't have the working capital to restart their businesses, to plant their seeds and so on. And I'm deeply concerned, and I can only hope that some of the multilateral agencies in particular will come forward with loan guarantee funds in order to help businesses respond to these challenges. And finally, I'd like to make an observation on digital credit. To date, digital credit in Kenya has largely been for consumer credit, at worst for betting, sports betting. We need to work on approaches to reinvent digital credit in Kenya so that it meets the needs of micro and small enterprises. It needs a complete overhaul. And I really hope that some donor agencies will step forward to work alongside us to do that. I think that's enough from me. Thank you all so much for joining us. You will see the reports on our website. I've also added links to them in the discussion or chat of Zoom. And with that, I thank you all again and wish you the very best. And may Kenya, which remains very close to my heart, having spent 5.5 years living there, I hope that it recovers from this crisis as quickly as possible. All the best, and thank you.